Imagine a world where your entire future, your home, your children, and even your legal identity could be stripped away from you in a single breath. All it took were three simple words, spoken not by a judge or a king, but by your own husband. For the women of ancient Rome, the most powerful civilization the world had ever seen, this was a nightmare. Tonight, we journey back in time, not to the gleaming marble temples or the thunderous Colosseum, but into the silent, private chambers of Roman households, where the true, shocking nature of their society was laid bare. We'll uncover a legal system where a husband could divorce his wife with the casual ease of dismissing a servant, yet a woman had absolutely no say in the matter. We'll learn how women were legally classified as property, their value appraised like livestock, and their lives governed by the whims of the men who owned them. This is a story of power, control, and heartbreaking injustice. But it's also a story of incredible resilience. Even in the most oppressive system imaginable, women found ingenious ways to fight back, to find loopholes, and to wield a hidden power that could shape the destiny of an empire. The echoes of these ancient laws still whisper in the halls of our own modern world in ways you'd never expect. Find a comfortable spot, dim the lights, and let your mind drift back 2,000 years. If you find this journey into the past as fascinating as I do, and you want to continue exploring the forgotten corners of history with us, consider becoming part of our community by hitting that subscribe button. Your support is what makes these deep dives possible. It's a bright morning in the year 100 AD. The air in Rome is thick with the smell of baking bread and the distant chatter from the bustling forum. In the tranquil garden of a wealthy villa, a young woman named Livia is tending to her herbs. She is 22 years old, and for 8 of those years, she is, like all marriages for women of her class, was an arrangement made by her father when she was just a girl of 14. She didn't choose her husband, Marcus, but she has built a life with him. She manages his household, oversees the slaves, and has given him 2 healthy sons. She hears his footsteps approaching, heavy, deliberate, and a knot of unease tightens in her stomach. Marcus stands before her, his face a mask of cold indifference. In his hand, he holds a small, rolled scroll. Her heart begins to pound, a frantic drum against her ribs, though she doesn't yet know why. He doesn't meet her eyes. He simply looks past her, towards the cypress trees at the edge of the garden, and speaks 3 short Latin words. Tua's residential tibia bido. Take your things for yourself. No argument, no explanation, no chance for appeal. With those 3 words, Livia's 8-year marriage is over. Her life, as she knows it, has just been obliterated. She has no recourse. She is no longer the mistress of this house. Her sons are no longer hers to raise. She is, in an instant, a woman with no home and no future. You might think this is an exaggeration, a dramatic retelling for effect, but this is a jaw-dropping historical truth. In ancient Rome, divorce for a man was quite literally that simple. The Roman legal system, a framework so influential that it's still studied in law schools today, was built on a foundation of gender inequality, so profound it is difficult for the modern mind to comprehend. Roman marriage was not a union of hearts. It was a business transaction. It was a strategic alliance between families designed to consolidate wealth, secure political power, and produce legitimate heirs. When a Roman girl, and I say girl because the average age of marriage was between 12 and 16, entered into this contract, she wasn't just joining a new family. She was being transferred from one owner to another. The legal term for this transfer was in manum, which literally means in the hand. A woman passed from her father's hand into her husband's. She was now under his complete authority. In the eyes of the law, she became his property, no different from his land, his horses, or his slaves. Her dowry became his control, and any property she might later inherit was legally his as well. This concept of male authority was enshrined in Rome's earliest legal code, the 12 Tables, written around 450 BC. These laws, which formed the bedrock of Roman jurisprudence for centuries, were shockingly silent on the rights of women in marriage. Quite simply, they had none. Women were legally classified as perpetual minors. Think about that for a moment. A mother running a vast household, a manager of staff and finances, could never legally make a decision about her own life. She was forever a child in the eyes of the law, always requiring the guardianship of a man. This absolute power was held by the male head of the household, the paterfamilias, known as patria potestas, or the power of the father, was absolute and terrifying. It gave him the power of life and death over everyone in his household. This wasn't a dusty, theoretical power. It was a real and present authority. A paterfamilias could legally order the death of his own children if he deemed them unworthy or simply couldn't afford to raise them. And if a man held that power over his own flesh and blood, imagine the rights his wife had. So, if Marcus wanted to divorce Livia, his reasons were his own. Perhaps he had grown bored of her. Perhaps he had found a younger woman with a larger dowry. Maybe he simply disliked the way she arranged the dining room. His word was law. But what if the situation were... What if Livia was the one who was miserable? What if Marcus was cruel, abusive, or squandered her dowry on gambling and other women? By the way, was perfectly legal and socially acceptable for Roman men. Livia had zero options. To even contemplate it would have been unthinkable, a violation of the natural order. Her duty was to endure. Even the most powerful woman in Rome was not immune. Consider Livia Drusilla, the formidable wife of the first Roman emperor, Augustus. For 50 years, she was the most influential woman in the known world, a brilliant political strategist who helped shape the Roman Empire from behind the scenes. Despite all her intelligence, wealth, and unofficial power, she was still technically at the mercy of her husband. At any point, Augustus had decided to utter those 3 words. She would have been powerless to stop him. This wasn't considered cruel or unusual by Roman standards. Roman society was built on a rigid hierarchy that they believed was as natural as the rising and setting of the sun. The gods had ordained it, the ancestors had practiced it, and the strength of the empire depended on it. They would likely look at our modern ideas of marriage equality and see them as a recipe for chaos and civilizational collapse. But here's where the story becomes even more fascinating. Roman women were not passive victims. They were survivors. They found ways to navigate this oppressive system, to protect themselves and their children in a world designed to keep them powerless. They became masters of what we might call soft power. Before we delve into the ingenious ways these women... Where are you watching this from tonight? What part of the story has shocked you the most so far? Drop a comment below. I love reading your thoughts and connecting with our community of history lovers from all around the globe. It's in sharing these stories that we keep the memories of people like Livia alive. The divorce process itself was a masterpiece of brutal simplicity. Once the words were spoken, the woman had to gather her personal belongings, her clothing, her jewelry, anything she had brought into the marriage with her that was not part of the dowry. She had to leave the house that had been her home, the life she had built, and return to her father's household, provided he was still alive and willing to take her back. She could find herself utterly destitute, dependent on the charity of her male relatives. The children stayed. In the eyes of Roman law, children were the property of their father. They belonged to his family line. A divorced woman had no legal right to her own children. She could be forbidden from ever seeing them again. Her role as a mother was erased as cleanly as her role as a wife. This was often the most devastating blow, a wound that would never heal. A woman could lose everything she held dear in the time it took to utter a single sentence. Roman society was never simple. While women couldn't initiate divorce, the system did contain a few, let's call them loopholes. And through these tiny cracks in the legal fortress, some incredibly clever and determined women found ways to escape unbearable situations. These stories of resistance reveal a hidden world of female ingenuity that historians are only now beginning to fully appreciate. As we settle in together, try to imagine what would feel like to live in Livia's world. To wake up every morning knowing that your entire existence depended on the mood of another person. To love your children with all your heart, but know they could be taken from you in an instant. It's a world that seems impossibly distant from our own. The legal DNA of ancient Rome is surprisingly resilient. The principles that governed Roman marriage influenced legal systems across Europe for centuries, and eventually, their echoes found their way into English common law, and from there to America. Some of these ancient ideas about marriage, property, and the roles of men and women persisted well into the 20th century. We are just beginning our journey. We're going to dive deeper into something that might be even more shocking than the divorce laws, how the Romans actually viewed love itself, and why they believed our modern obsession with marrying for romance would destroy civilization. We'll discover the 3 different types of Roman weddings, and how the ceremony you had could determine whether you lived as a wife or a well-kept slave. To truly understand why Roman marriage was so cold and calculating, we have to get inside their heads. The Romans didn't just have a different view of love than we do. They thought our modern concept of romantic love was genuinely dangerous, a form of temporary insanity that could lead to the ruin of families and the state. The Latin word for passionate, all-consuming love was amor, but to a Roman, amor was not something to be celebrated. It was a madness to be avoided, especially when making a decision as important as marriage. They saw marrying for love as equivalent to making a major business deal while intoxicated. Completely irresponsible. Consider the case of Marcus Tullius Cicero, one of Rome's greatest philosophers and statesmen. In 46 BC, at the age of 60, Cicero shocked polite society by divorcing his wife of 30 years, Terentia. He wanted to marry his teenage ward, a girl young enough to be his granddaughter. But when his friends criticized him, Cicero didn't defend his actions with talk of love or passion. His reasoning was brutally practical. He needed Publilia's large dowry to pay off his mounting debts. In his own writings, he defended the decision by stating that marriage should be a union of minds and resources, not hearts. This was a prevailing view among the Roman elite. Marriage was the bedrock of their society's strength. Every union had to serve a purpose larger than the personal happiness of the two individuals involved. It was about creating strong alliances, transferring property efficiently, and ensuring continuation of the family line with legitimate heirs. To choose a spouse based on a fleeting emotion like love was seen as not just a personal failing, but betrayal of one's duty to family. A famous Roman author put it this way: a man who chooses his wife with his heart rather than his head weakens not just his household, but the entire empire. Imagine being a young Roman woman, taught from birth that your future marriage had nothing to do with your own happiness or desires. There would be no courtship, no romantic dates, no falling in love. Instead, there would be negotiations. How much dowry could your family offer? Political connections did your family bring to the table? How would this alliance benefit both households? The Roman historian Tacitus described a typical aristocratic marriage arrangement where the bride and groom might meet for the very first time at their betrothal ceremony. Love, if it developed at all, was expected to grow slowly from a foundation of mutual respect and shared duty. And here's the mind-blowing part. For Roman society, this system worked. For centuries, Rome grew to become the most powerful empire in history, in part because these strategic marriages created a stable and interconnected ruling class. Every wedding was like a treaty, binding powerful families together in a web of mutual obligation. The only daughter of the Emperor Augustus, her life was a tragic testament to this principle. She was married off 3 times, each a calculated political move by her father. Her first husband was his nephew, meant to keep power within the imperial family. When he died, Augustus married her to his most trusted general, Agrippa, to secure his loyalty. When Agrippa died, Julia, still a young woman, was forced to marry her stepbrother, Tiberius, to solidify the line of succession. Her own feelings in these matters were completely irrelevant. We know from historical records that Julia was deeply unhappy. She eventually rebelled against her father's iron control so dramatically that he exiled her to a remote where she died alone and broken. Her story is a heartbreaking reminder of the human cost of the system. Romans were still human, had passionate affairs, and wrote some of the most beautiful love poetry ever created. But when they did fall in love, it was often outside the bounds of marriage and frequently led to scandal and tragedy. The most famous love story in Roman history is that of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. But think about how that story is remembered, not as a beautiful romance, but as a cautionary tale. Romans genuinely believed that Antony's amour for Cleopatra made him weak, irrational, and led him to make disastrous military decisions that ultimately cost him the empire. Love, to the Romans, could literally destroy you. Within this rigid and pragmatic system, Roman women learned to be incredibly resourceful. Denied legal power, they became masters of unofficial influence. They learned to persuade their husbands, guide their sons, and build powerful networks within their social circles. A woman named Cornelia, mother of the famous political reformers, is a perfect example. After her husband died, she refused several offers of marriage, including one from a king, because she realized she had more power and influence as an independent widow and the mother of prominent sons. When a visitor once complimented her on her beautiful jewelry, Cornelia famously pointed to her 2 boys and said, "These are my jewels." She had found a way to create her own power base outside the confines of marriage. The more you study Roman attitudes toward love, the more you realize just how revolutionary our modern ideas are. The notion that you should marry for love, that personal happiness should be the central goal of a partnership, is a relatively recent invention in human history. The Romans would have found it absolutely terrifying. They would look at our divorce rates, our entire culture built around the pursuit of romance, and they would see a civilization in chaos. You mean people base the most important alliance of their lives on a feeling that might change by next week? They would ask in disbelief, And honestly, sometimes when you're scrolling through endless profiles or dealing with modern dating drama, you can almost see their point. But then you remember Julia, alone on her island, and all the millions of other women like her whose hearts and desires were sacrificed on the altar of family duty and political expediency. And you become grateful that we live in a time when love, messy and complicated as it is, at least gets to be part of the equation. The Roman approach to marriage was like their approach to building aqueducts, organized, efficient, and ruthlessly focused on the greater good of the empire. But that efficiency came at a terrible human cost, a cost we are still trying to fully understand. Because while the Romans were brutally practical about marriage, they created not one, not two, but three completely different types of wedding ceremonies. And the type of ceremony a woman had would determine everything about her future, including whether she could be dismissed with those three simple words, or whether her legal chains were forged in a much more permanent fire. Let's explore these three ceremonies, because the type of wedding a Roman woman had could mean the difference between being a prisoner in her own home. Imagine three young women, all getting married on the same day in Rome. Their ceremonies look completely different, and the legal consequences of those ceremonies will shape the rest of their lives. Our first bride, let's call her Claudia, is from one of Rome's oldest and most powerful patrician families. Her wedding is the most sacred and ancient of all, the confarreatio, religious ritual presided over by the Pontifex Maximus, the highest priest in Rome. Claudia and her groom share a special cake made from spelt wheat called panis varius, in front of 10 witnesses. It's a beautiful and impressive ceremony, steeped in tradition and honor. By participating in this sacred rite, Claudia is entering into the strictest form of Roman marriage. She is placed completely under her husband's manus. From this moment forward, she is his legal property, with no more rights than his furniture. Divorce for her is almost impossible, not because the law protects her, but because undoing the sacred union required an equally complex and expensive religious ceremony called a differentiatio, which most men would never bother with. They would simply find other ways to make her life miserable if she displeased them. Let's look at our second bride, Antonia. She's from a respectable middle-class family. Her ceremony is called a coemptio, which literally means by purchase. In a symbolic ritual, her father sells her to her husband for a single bronze coin. It sounds degrading, but this ceremony was actually a clever legal maneuver. Because it was framed as a property sale, it was governed by property law, not religious law. Property transactions could be undone. Clever families could even write escape clauses into the symbolic sale, creating a kind of ancient prenuptial agreement. This form of marriage still placed her under her husband's authority, but offered a potential exit door if the marriage became unbearable. We have our third bride, Valeria. Her wedding is the simplest of all, called in usus, which just means by use or by habit. There are no priests, no cakes, no coins. She simply moves into her husband's house. It looks almost modern, like a couple deciding to live together. But here's where Roman law gets incredibly tricky. If Valeria lived with her husband continuously for 1 full year, she would automatically fall under his manus, just like the other two brides. If she was smart and well-advised, she knew about the trinoxium, the rule of 3 nights. All she had to do was leave her husband's house for 3 consecutive nights each year before the anniversary of her moving in. She legally interrupted the uses and prevented herself from ever falling under his complete control. She remained legally tied to her own family and retained a degree of independence that the other brides could only dream of. Can you imagine the stress? Spending your entire married life watching the calendar, making sure to take your 3-night freedom trip, knowing that if you ever forgot or were prevented from leaving, you would lose your legal personhood forever. The famous Roman jurist Gaius wrote about this very practice, noting that many women in his time deliberately interrupted their usus marriage each year, preferring the inconvenience of annual separation to the permanence of manus, literally fighting for their freedom, 1 year at a time. The tragic irony is that the more prestigious a woman's family, the fewer options she had. The elite, like Claudia, were almost always married by confarreatio, the most restrictive form. Women from humbler backgrounds who married by the simple usus often had the most legal freedom, even if they had less social power. It was a twisted reality where high status meant a more gilded cage, and a woman had no choice in the matter. The decision was made entirely by her family, based on tradition, social standing, and cost. A woman could spend her engagement dreaming of the freedom of a usus marriage, only to discover on her wedding day that her family had arranged for the unbreakable chains of confarreatio. The legal scholar Ulpian wrote with heartbreaking insight, "Many women weep at confarreatio ceremonies, and their families believe it is from joy. Often it is from despair." This entire system was designed to keep women in a state of perpetual legal childhood, their lives dictated by the men who held the power of the paterfamilias. This authority wasn't just about big decisions like marriage and divorce. It extended to every facet of a woman's life. She couldn't enter into contracts, sell property, or even travel outside the city without her male guardian's permission. The historian Livy tells a story of one woman who was publicly beaten by her husband for attending a wine festival, and the community supported his actions. He was simply exercising his legitimate authority. But human nature is a powerful force. Even within this suffocating, women found ways to breathe. They created influence networks, informal power structures that operated behind the official male authority. They became masters of persuasion and strategic thinking because their survival depended on it. Women like Livia Drusilla, the wife of Augustus, wielded enormous unofficial power. She had no political authority. She was one of the most powerful people in the empire, influencing policy, appointments, and even military campaigns through her unique access to and influence over her husband. But her power was always precarious. It was entirely dependent on her relationship with Augustus, and it could all vanish. She spent her entire life walking a tightrope, knowing one wrong step could mean utter ruin. This was the world Roman women, a world where their intelligence and capability meant nothing without male approval, and where the law itself was designed to keep them powerless. And this brings us to the most chilling aspect of all. What happened when a man decided to end the marriage? Let's return to our fictional Livia, standing in her garden as her husband utters those three fateful words, "Tua's residential tibi habito." According to Roman legal procedure, she has exactly one day to gather her personal belongings. She must walk to the house that was her home and claim only what is hers. The furniture she chose, the decorations she arranged, the garden she lovingly tended. All of it belongs to her husband. But the most devastating part is the children, her sons, 8-year-old Gaius and 6-year-old Lucius. She is now legally a stranger to them. The speed and brutality of Roman divorce was legendary in the ancient world. The Greek historian Plutarch wrote with amazement, "A Roman man can dissolve his marriage faster than a Greek can sacrifice a goat to the gods." But the cruelty was amplified by the required ritual of humiliation. The divorce had to be witnessed by at least 7 adult male citizens. These witnesses weren't there to ensure fairness. They were there to serve as legal proof that the marriage was dissolved, protecting the husband from any future claims. Imagine packing the fragments of your life while 7 men stand by, watching your every move. Their stylus is scratching on wax tablets, recording your tears as evidence. To add insult to injury, it was customary for the husband to provide a written letter of divorce, explaining his reasons. These letters, some of which have survived, are masterpieces of calculated cruelty. One from 89 AD reads, "To Claudia from Marcus, you have failed as a wife through your excessive vanity, your inability to manage the servants properly, and your unfortunate tendency to express opinions on matters beyond a woman's understanding." It served no legal purpose. It was pure psychological warfare, designed to crush a woman's spirit completely. A woman's social existence was erased. Roman society had no place for a divorced woman. She was not a wife, not a maiden. She was a displaced person, her status and future uncertain. Census records from the period show the brutal reality. Divorced women had a mortality rate 40% higher than married women, largely due to poverty, stress, and social isolation. A system designed not just to control women, but to make the threat of divorce so terrifying that they would endure almost any hardship to avoid it. The ease of Roman divorce wasn't a feature of progressive society. It was a weapon, held perpetually over the head of every Roman wife. But even in this darkest of worlds, stories of defiance shine through. In 42 BC, a woman named Hortensia did something unprecedented. When the government tried to levy a heavy tax on wealthy women to fund a war, she marched into the Forum, the heart of male power, and delivered a fiery public speech. Since women were legally barred from public speaking, she used the law's own logic against it. She argued that since all women were legal minors, she, as their representative, had the right to speak on their behalf. Her logic was so brilliant, and her speech so powerful, that the government was forced to reduce the tax. She had used the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, even if just for a day. Hortensia's audacity inspired other women. An underground network began to form, women studying Roman law not to become lawyers, But to find escape routes, they discovered that the legal code, in its vast complexity, was full of contradictions. Claudia Quinta escaped an abusive marriage by proving her father had coerced her into it, rendering the contract legally void from the start. Claimed a divine vision from the goddess Vesta commanded her to take a vow of celibacy. Religious obligations trumped even the authority of a husband, providing a sacred and unchallengeable escape route. These stories, while rare, reveal the incredible spirit of Roman women. They were denied a formal education, yet they became more sophisticated legal strategists than many trained lawyers. Their survival depended on it. This legal landscape began to face a seismic shift with the rise of a radical new religion. The Christian faith introduced a revolutionary idea that marriage was not a business contract, but a sacred, indissoluble covenant before God. Early Christian writers like Augustine declared that no earthly authority could dissolve what God had joined together. This was a direct declaration of war on Roman family law. Empowered by this new doctrine, began refusing to accept divorces. A couple could be divorced under Roman law, but still married in the eyes of the church. The empire was faced with a parallel legal system when Emperor Constantine tried to crush this rebellion with threats of exile and execution. It only made the Christians more defiant. They created an underground railroad for divorced women, employing them and protecting them from Roman authorities. Christianity didn't just challenge divorce, it challenged the very foundation of Roman marriage. It insisted that marriage should be based on love and mutual respect, not property and politics. It proclaimed the spiritual equality of men and women. Over centuries, these radical ideas began to seep into the foundations of Roman law. When the Roman Empire finally fell in 476 AD, its legal system didn't vanish, and from those fragments, a new world emerged. The collision of Roman legal tradition, Germanic tribal customs, and Christian doctrine created the foundation of medieval law. By the year 1100, this synthesis had crystallized into what we now call canon law, and it gave women rights that would have been unthinkable in ancient Rome. For the first time in Western history, a woman's consent was required for marriage. The absolute power of the paterfamilias was broken. Divorce became virtually impossible for either party, while restrictive also protected women from being casually abandoned. The echoes of this long, complex history are all around us. When a couple signs a prenuptial agreement, they are participating in a tradition that goes back to the coemptio marriage and its symbolic sale. When courts today debate the separation of church and state in marriage law, they are grappling with the same conflict that erupted between the Roman Empire and the early Christians. From a world where a woman was property to a world where she is a legal person with rights was long, brutal, and fought for by countless forgotten women. The story of Roman marriage law is a powerful reminder that the rights we take for granted today were not given. They were won. They were won by women like Hortensia, who dared to speak when she was told to be silent. They were won by women who spent their lives poring over legal texts, searching for a single loophole that could mean freedom. And they were won by every woman who endured, survived, and passed down the fire of her spirit to her daughters. Their struggle laid the groundwork for the world we inhabit today. It's a world they could never have imagined, but one that was built on the foundations of their quiet courage. Their story is a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to seek justice, even in the face of impossible odds. And it's a story that reminds us that the fight for true equality is a marathon, not a sprint, one that has been run for thousands of years and continues to this day. The journey from that Roman garden to our modern world was not a simple, linear progression. It was a chaotic, bloody, and painstakingly slow evolution, fought in courtrooms, in churches, on battlefields, and in the quiet defiance of millions of homes. The principles of Roman law were so deeply embedded in the Western psyche that they clung to our legal systems like ghosts, whispering ancient prejudices into the ears of supposedly enlightened lawmakers for centuries. When the first American feminists in the 19th century began to argue for a woman's right to own property after marriage, they weren't inventing a new idea. They were fighting to dismantle a 2,000-year-old legal principle born in Rome. They were challenging the ghost of Manus. When lawyers in the 20th century fought to make domestic violence a public crime rather than a private family matter, they were battling the lingering shadow of patria potestas and the Roman belief that a man's home was his absolute kingdom. The legal battles we consider modern landmarks of progress are, in many ways, the final chapters of a story that began in the Roman Republic. The fight for equal pay challenges a Roman assumption that a woman's economic contribution is secondary to a man's. The struggle for reproductive rights is a direct confrontation with the ancient idea that a woman's body is not her own, but a vessel for the continuation of a male lineage. The ongoing global movement against forced marriage is a modern war against the foundational Roman practice of using daughters as currency in familial transactions. Even the very structure of our legal world is a Roman inheritance. The idea that laws should be written down, organized into codes, and applied consistently. The concept of lawyers arguing a case based on evidence and precedent. The existence of a formal court system itself. All of these are Roman innovations. The irony is staggering. The very legal tools that were designed to control and oppress Roman women became, through centuries of struggle and reinterpretation, the very tools used to achieve their liberation. The master's tools, wielded by generations of defiant hands, were ultimately used to dismantle the master's house. Winding history teaches us a crucial lesson. Progress is not inevitable. The rights we have today are not the natural state of humanity. They are the hard-won results of constant, relentless effort. They were secured by women who used canon law to escape abusive medieval husbands, by women who published anonymous pamphlets demanding the right to an education, by women who marched in the streets for the right to vote, and by women who, in our own lifetimes, have stood before the highest courts of the land to demand that they be recognized as fully equal citizens. Each of these victories built upon the last. Each generation pushed the boundaries of justice a little further, standing on the shoulders of the women who came before them. And that legal rights are like a garden. They are not monuments carved in stone, but living things that require constant tending. If they are neglected, they can wither. If they are not protected, they can be trampled. The next time you sign your name on a contract, open a bank account in your own name, cast a vote, or make a decision about your own body and future, take a moment to feel the weight of that history. In that simple act lies a power that Livia, Julia, and Cornelia could only have dreamed of. In that freedom lies the legacy of their struggle. Then, would those Roman women think of our world? I believe they would be in awe of our freedoms, but they would also be impatient with our complacency. They would look at the remaining injustices, the lingering inequalities, the places in the world where women still live under laws not so different from their own, and they would be baffled by our lack of urgency, who had to fight for every scrap of dignity, would urge us not to take a single right for granted. They would tell us that the fight is not over. They would want us to be the new Hortensias, using our voices and our education to challenge injustice. They would want us to be the new escape artists, finding the loopholes in systems that are still rigged against so many. They would want us to be the guardians of the progress they died fighting for. The story of marriage, law, and power is still being written. We are all living in one of its chapters. The choices we make, the standards we accept, the injustices we refuse to tolerate, these will determine the story that future generations tell about us. If this journey through time has moved you, if it has made you think about our world in a new way, then please help us keep these vital stories alive. Join the conversation in the comments below. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel. You're not just watching videos. You're becoming a part of a community dedicated to understanding our past so that we can better shape our future. The journey from Tua's residential tibi habito to I do, chosen freely and as an equal partner, was not measured in miles, but in millennia of courage. It is now our turn to continue that journey, to honor that legacy, and to ensure the arc of history continues to bend, however slowly, toward justice for all.